Hello again, my name is Pam, and it's time for the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, February the 19th, 2021. Our first article, 4 impeachments, 0 removals, sign of cracks in the Constitution, by Peter Greer. After 2 tumultuous impeachments of former President Donald Trump in little over a year, it's clear that today the impeachment process works far differently than the Founding Fathers intended. The authors of the Constitution believed that members of Congress would rally together to defend the legislature's prerogatives against intrusions from the executive. But James Madison and his fellows didn't foresee the effects of the rise of political parties. Partisanship has proved a far more effective unifying force than institutional identity. Last week, the votes of all but 7 Senate Republicans acquitted Mr. Trump of charges related to the invasion of the U.S. Capitol. But this isn't the only constitutional hole exposed in the Trump era. From the ineffectiveness of congressional subpoenas to the White House, to the imbalance in the relative power of urban and rural votes, Mr. Trump's norm-breaking presidency has highlighted a number of flaws in the U.S. democratic system. What I would emphasize is there are structural problems with our democracy, some of which are really hard to fix, but some of which have emerged recently, which there are fixes for, says Thomas Keck, a professor of political science at Syracuse University in New York State. 3 presidents tried and not convicted. Impeachment is the problem most recently on public display. It was meant as a check on abuse of power by officials via threat of removal. While federal judges and lower-level members of the executive branch have indeed lost their jobs through impeachment trials, no president has ever been impeached in the House, convicted by the Senate, and summarily removed from the Oval Office. The sample size is small. Only 3 presidents have been impeached by the House: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. Richard Nixon resigned under threat of almost certain impeachment and removal. But Senate votes to convict impeached presidents have been almost entirely partisan. The 7 Republicans who voted guilty on Mr. Trump's second impeachment represent a high water mark for bipartisanship by far. Prior to last week, only 1 senator had ever voted to convict a president of their own party. Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska was one of the 7. In a statement explaining his vote, he said that Congress has become a weaker institution than the framers thought it would be. If Congress can't respond to an attack on itself instigated by the head of the executive branch, the constitutional balance of power will be further tilted away from the Capitol, according to Senator Sasse. That's unacceptable. This institution needs to respect itself enough to tell the executive that some lines cannot be crossed, he wrote. Should Congress just give up on impeachment, recognizing that in today's balanced and fraught political environment, that removal of a president is highly unlikely? A vote to simply censor Mr. Trump might have had a better chance of success. Professor Keck believes that impeachment remains an exceptional tool for exceptional circumstances, but that lawmakers and voters should realize its primary function is not removal, but documentation. It lays down a marker for historians. In decades to come, Mr. Trump's impeachments will be mentioned high in descriptions of his presidency, as will Mr. Clinton's and Mr. Johnson's singular impeachment rebukes. I do think the House managers did a really effective job of getting out the first draft of history, says Professor Keck of last week's Senate trial. Could impeachment become commonplace? There is also the chance that impeachment, rather than being abandoned, will become more regular, a common tool of partisan struggle. In the wake of Mr. Trump's acquittal, some Republicans have threatened a tit-for-tat relationship if the GOP retakes the House in 2022. On Fox News on Sunday, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina implied that Vice President Kamala Harris could be impeached for expressing support for a bail fund for Black Lives Matters protesters. During Mr. Trump's trial, his own lawyers warned that impeachments will become commonplace and said that even out of office Democratic presidents might now be hauled back for trial. It's possible that the downward spiral of partisanship could take the country into a place where any and all means of harassing a president from the opposing party become conceivable. But that would likely mean taking flimsier charges more seriously or trying to impeach a president for relatively small offenses. Many in the Senate probably remember Bill Clinton's impeachment on charges of lying about his affair with a young intern, says Frank Bauman, an expert on impeachment at the University of Missouri School of Law. Voters at the time had a negative view of the prosecution of Mr. Clinton. His approval rating rose. If these guys have got any political memory or anybody around to remind them, they'll remember that egregious misuses of impeachment have a tendency to backfire on the party, says Professor Bauman. He rejects the notion that impeachment is more broken than it ever has been. It simply reflects the reality of hyper-partisanship in the country and a Congress where real work has almost ground to a halt. The impeachment mechanism, like any other of the components of the Constitution, is no better than the people that move the levers, he said. Constitutional hardball. The frequency of impeachments has accelerated in recent years, but given that number are still very small. It's hard to know if that's a stable trend or just statistical noise. There have been periods of intense polarization and divided government. Think the presidencies of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. That didn't produce impeachments. Political scientists don't really have a unified theory on the condition that leads to impeachment, but they may occur in periods when the rules of government become muddled, said Julia Azari, assistant chair of political science at Marquette University. It's really about when gray areas emerge, and that's just as much about the political context as it is about the president himself, she says. So, whatever occurs with the cycle of impeachments, other aspects of partisan real politic may accelerate. Senator Mitch McConnell's long blockade of Obama nominee Merrick Garland to save a Supreme Court seat for Republicans could lead to further tough actions on high court nominees. Mr. Trump ignored many congressional subpoenas for testimony and administration witnesses with apparent impunity, perhaps setting a precedent. The Trump presidency also proved that it is possible to avoid the need for Senate confirmation for top officials by simply playing a shell game with acting appointments. Today's voters like it when their politicians play constitutional hardball, says Professor Azari. This is especially true of Republican voters increasingly insecure about their place in the U.S. as the nation becomes more diverse and their party's strength wanes. On the other hand, the lesson of 2020 and 2021 may be that competence and policy matter. Dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, organizing vaccine distribution, keeping electricity flowing in the face of climate change-driven storms, all of this requires political action as opposed to shouting on cable news. We are seeing a resurgence in the idea that there needs to be some governance, says Professor Azari. The big picture is that the country is struggling to deal with all these real problems, even as its politics attempt to represent more constituencies than ever before. Discomfort is inevitable. Democracy has expanded, said Professor Azari. The kind of people who have access to positions of power has expanded, and that is going to make things more complicated. And that is not a bad thing. The headlines of our next article state, in post-Brexit UK, some Britons still embrace a European identity, by Shafi Musaddiq. In London, by her own admission, Jane Rickerman steered clear of politics for much of her life. That all changed when Brexit happened and her German husband had to take dual British citizenship to stay in the country. With Britain's decision to leave the European Union, Miss Rickman says she felt a new sense of European identity, even if it is one born out of loss. Being part of a wider community where once I could live and work freely was very important to me. Countries without borders, she said from her home in the historic English city of Bath, a place she describes as politically a donut, an enclave of those who voted to remain in Europe, surrounded by Brexiteers. I feel the loss of my legal EU identity keenly, she says. The people I've campaigned with have similar feelings and still consider themselves European. Ms. Rickman is part of a significant number of Britons who regard themselves not only as British, but as European. Despite Britain's decision to leave the EU, a sense of interconnectedness with the continent has manifested itself increasingly since the 2016 referendum. But with Brexit now realized, European minded Britons are left to find a new way to express their identity. For some, that has meant trying to create a new pro Europe media to counter the largely Brexit leaning mainstream. Others are attempting to set the stage for a British return to the bloc in some form. Though a Europeanist path for Britons is foggy, if it exists at all, those like Ms. Rickman are staunch in their faith. I have never wavered in my belief in Europe, she says. In the almost 5 years since the referendum, I have become stronger in my conviction that leaving Europe is a huge mistake. But where do we go from now? Feeling European after Brexit? For Britons, like Alex Agnew, a university student and campaigner, being in the EU meant being part of a shared cultural identity that genuinely worked to bring down artificial travel and work barriers. And anti Brexit journalist Sam Bright says a European identity has helped him to feel a part of the struggle to protect and extend liberal democracy, social equality, opportunity, and common welfare. Having a general sense of cooperation and treating asylum seekers and immigrants with fairness, having a fairer and more just economic system, he says. That's perhaps not quite as radical as people may think, but being European meant supporting these core values. The rise of populism, he argues, only serves to increase people's desire to identify as European in Britain. Ms. Reichman has expressed herself by establishing a grassroots protest groups and publicly displaying her affection for all things Europe. A yellow painted owl statue by the name of Libby, named after the Liberal Democrats, Britain's pro EU political party, sits perched proudly by Ms. Rickman's window. Her anti Brexit campaign group, Bath for Europe, created handmade EU themed berets that quickly became iconic symbols of British Europeanism for protests that attracted 1 million people into London's streets in 2018. Her anti Brexit group designed fake anti Brexit banknotes featuring Boris Johnson, now stored in the British Museum. Mike Buckley, director of the Labour for Europe group, says Britons will increasingly miss out on chance encounters with European migrants that enrich daily lives. Over 700,000 migrant workers left Britain in 2020, a vast majority of them returning back to Eastern Europe. We've all been used to finding Europeans behind the counter at Starbucks. Now, suddenly, you'll get British accents talking at you. We'll think, what happened to London? The pro-European small-scale media that have rapidly emerged since Brexit are helping to create a community for Britons to maintain a pro-European identity despite the UK's rupture from Brussels. Mr. Bright, who has worked for pro-European British publications Graham News and Byline Times, says pro-European Britons have created an impetus for new media publications tapping into a desire to keep Britain European in vision. And in that pursuit, pro-Europeans have caused a realignment of the media space, dominated by conservative-leaning legacy publications in favor of Brexit. A path back to Europe? While Brexit has faded from public discussion this year, pro-European Britons continue to pour their energy into campaigns for a political and cultural union to return. Campaign group Stay European gained more than 162,000 members in 2020 with its vision for Britain to apply for associate membership, the closest relationship a country can have to the bloc while remaining outside the EU. Mr. Agnew, who was too young to vote in 2016, says that while the emotive arguments have been lost for Britain returning to the European fold, change requires baby steps, such as trying to get facts out in a nonpartisan way and informing the public about how boring policy hits people's daily lives. Mr. Buckley says he staunchly believes that young Britain's growing sense of belonging to a pro-European movement will inevitably lead to the country returning to the EU. If you think gay marriage is fine when you're 20, you don't hate it when you're 50. I think young people's pro-Europeanism will stick around as they get older and are more likely to vote. Like many others, though, he fears there are few, if any, political cheerleaders championing Britons who feel aligned with Europe. Still, across the English Channel, Lise Schrenmacher, a Dutch member of the European Parliament, says the century-old exchange of people and ideas between the UK and her native Netherlands is an example of a deep-rooted Europeanness that will never be broken. Get the monitors. Oops, sorry about that. There will always be cultural ties between the EU and the UK. I think we will keep that bond strong, she says, speaking as a Dutch woman. They, the Britons, are our neighbors. Many of our citizens have connections with the UK through family or study or work. I believe it will be good for the UK to return to the EU. There's a new word, the Briturn. Moving on, our next article is titled, Why is it so cold? Also, why is it so warm? Scientists Explain, by Seth Borenstein. It's as if the world has been turned upside down, or at least its weather. You can blame the increasingly familiar polar vortex, which has brought a taste of the Arctic to places where winter often requires no more than a jacket. Around the North Pole, winter's ultra-cold air is usually kept bottled up 15 to 30 miles high. That's the polar vortex, which spins like a whirling top at the top of the planet. But occasionally, something slams against the top, sending the cold air escaping from its Arctic home and heading south. It's been happening more often, and scientists are still not completely sure why, but they suggest it's a mix of natural random weather and human-caused climate change. This particular polar vortex breakdown has been a whopper. Meteorologists call it one of the biggest, nastiest, and longest lasting ones they've seen, and they've been watching since at least the 1950s. This week's weather is part of a pattern stretching back to January. It's been a major breakdown, said Jennifer Francis, a climate scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center on Cape Cod. It really is the cause of all these crazy weather events in the Northern Hemisphere. It's been unusual for a few weeks now. Very, very crazy, Miss Francis said. Totally topsy-turvy. Record cold in warmer places. Record sub-zero temperatures in Texas and Oklahoma knocked millions off the power grid and into deep freeze. A deadly tornado hit North Carolina. Other parts of the South saw thunder, snow, and reports of something that seemed like a snow tornado but wasn't. Snow fell hard, not just in Chicago, but in Greece and Turkey, where it's far less normal. Record cold also hit Europe this winter, earning the name the Beast from the East. The worst power outages in the United States were in Texas, affecting more than 2 million homes and businesses. More than 250,000 people also lost power across parts of Appalachia, and another 200,000 were without electricity following an ice storm in northwest Oregon, according to PowerOutage.us, which tracks utility outage reports. 4 million people lost power in Mexico. In Chicago, 1.5 feet of new snow forced public schools to cancel in-person classes for Tuesday. Hours earlier, along the normally balmy Gulf of Mexico, cross-country skier Sam Fagg hit fresh powder on the beach in Galveston, Texas. We've had everything you could possibly think of in the past week, said Northern Illinois University meteorology professor Victor Gensini, noting that parts of the United States have been 50 degrees colder than normal. It's been a wide range. It was warmer Tuesday in parts of Greenland, Alaska, Norway, and Sweden than in Texas and Oklahoma. And somehow, people in South Florida have been complaining about record warmth that is causing plants to bloom early. In the eastern Greenland town of Tasiilaq, it's been about 18 degrees warmer than normal, which is a bit of a nuisance, says Lars Rasmussen, a museum curator at the local cultural center. The warm weather makes dog sledding and driving on snow scooters a bit of a hassle. Several meteorologists squarely blame the polar vortex breakdown or disruption. These used to happen once every other year or so, but research shows they are now close to happening yearly, if not more, says Judah Cohen, a winter storm expert for atmospheric environmental research, a commercial firm outside of Boston. The spinning top gets toppled. The polar vortex spends winter in its normal place until an atmospheric wave, the type that brings weather patterns here and there, slams into it. Normally, such waves don't do much to the strong vortex, but occasionally the wave has enough energy to push the spinning top over, and that's when the frigid air breaks loose, Mr. Gensini says. Sometimes the cold air mass splits into chunks, an event that usually is connected to big snowstorms in the eastern U.S., like a few weeks ago. Other times it just moves to a new place, which often means bitter cold in parts of Europe. This time it did both, Mr. Cohen said. There was a split of the vortex in early January and another in mid-January. Then at the end of January came the displacement that caused cold air to spill into Europe and much of the United States, Mr. Cohen said. Both Mr. Cohen and Ms. Francis said there should be considered not one but three polar vortex disruptions, though some scientists lump it all together. While both the vortex and the wave that bumped it are natural, and polar vortex breakdowns happen naturally, there is likely an element of climate change at work. But it is not a sure thing that science agrees on, Mr. Cohen, Mr. Gensini, and Ms. Francis said. Warming in the Arctic with shrinking sea ice is goosing the atmospheric wave in two places, giving it more energy when it strikes the polar vortex, making it more likely to disrupt the vortex, Mr. Cohen said. There is evidence that climate change can weaken the polar vortex, which allows more chances for frigid Arctic air to ooze into the lower 48, says University of Georgia meteorologist Professor Marshall Shepard. Pattern has been observed for decades. There were strong polar vortex disruptions and cold outbreaks like these in the 1980s, Mr. Cohen said. I think it's historic and generational, Mr. Cohen said. I don't think it's unprecedented. This Arctic outbreak has to be thought of in context. The globe is much warmer than it used to be. It also feels colder because just before the outbreak, much of the United States was experiencing a milder than normal winter, with the ground not even frozen on Christmas Day in Chicago, Mr. Gensini said. The globe as a whole is about the same temperature as the average was from 1979 to 2000 for this time of year, according to the University of Maine's Climate Reanalyzer. That's still warmer than the 20th century average, and scientists don't think that this month has much of a chance to be colder than the 20th century average for the globe, something that hasn't happened since the early 1980s. One reason is that it will soon warm back up to normal when the polar vortex returns to its regular home, Mr. Cohen said. As for people thinking this cold outbreak disproves global warming, scientists say that's definitely not so. Even with climate change, we'll still have winter, says North Carolina state climatologist Kathy Dello. What we're seeing here is we're pretty unprepared for almost every type of extreme weather. It's pretty sad. And now, Points of Progress by Lindsay McGinnis. In Malaysia, an indigenous-led nonprofit, has installed about 40 micro hydro systems throughout Malaysian, Borneo, and peninsular Malaysia, bringing clean energy and a sense of agency to indigenous tribes. Tanabang, also known as Friends of Village Development, has been working for years to bring electricity to long marginalized communities in a way that preserves the people's culture and traditions. Tanabang is known for its emphasis on sustainable technology and for training and engaging tribe members to create jobs that stay local. Electricity has allowed the 50 families living in Kampung Buyan to build strategic relationships with neighboring villages, create ecotourism jobs, and safeguard the surrounding forest. Despite challenges posed by the pandemic, the group has several projects lined up, with an increasing focus on water and solar hybrid systems that use battery storage to ensure energy security. We want to advocate for Native rights to self determination and empower Indigenous groups to choose the kind of development that meets the aspirations of their people, says Adrian Bani Lazembang, Tonaberg's founder. Well, friends, that's the end of the reading for Friday's January. I'm sorry, that is the end of the reading for the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, February the 19th. My name is Pam. I hope that polar vortex gets back on track and we warm up soon. Thank you for having me in your home today. Be blessed. Make it a great day, people.